You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property and their laws? They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 459 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. He's a staff writer at RT. He's got bylines at antiwar.com, Consortium News, and the Libertarian Institute, which is, of course, where you find this show and my daily news roundup and some articles that me and Will have actually written together. So lots of great stuff in both of our archives over at libertarianinstitute.org. For Will Porter's work, make sure you check out his Twitter account at WKPANCAP, and that's where he posts all the stories he writes over at RT. So, Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back. How you doing?
I'm doing well, and I think we got a good one lined up today. This is going to be similar to the show that me and you put out last Monday, where we're just going through mainly stories that you've written over at RT and then talking about them in a little bit more detail. But the first one, I guess you haven't had a chance to cover at RT yet because it happened over the weekend, and that is Afghanistan. The Taliban there signed a peace deal, and I think we could put air quotes around the peace deal because is it really going to bring peace to Afghanistan? I think me and you will both agree that the answer to that is no, even if it does eventually lead to a reduction or complete withdrawal of U.S. troops there, but that is, the essential goal of this peace deal, Will, is to try to get all U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. Now, I guess a big asterisk on this whole thing is that we've been told, and there's been reports that there are some secret behind-the-scenes annexes to this peace deal that are going to allow at least U.S. what they're calling counterterrorism forces to remain in Afghanistan, I don't know, forever. So we could talk about, those secret annexes a little bit more in our discussion, but I think it's just important to put that at top that, from what we know, publicly about this peace deal, sounds like at the end of 14 months, all U.S. and NATO coalition forces should be gone. After 135 days, the U.S. would finally get back to the troop levels that were there during the end of the Obama administration. That's an important thing here, is that Donald Trump's going to claim a real victory and, winding down an endless war. Well, by the time the 2020 election rolls around, we're actually only going to have the 100 troops that we had, around the end of the Obama administration. There is supposed to be a reduction in NATO coalition forces from 16,000 to 12,000. And that same time frame, there is supposed to be a upcoming prisoner swap between the Afghan government and the Taliban, where the Afghan government releases 5,000 prisoners and the Taliban will release 1,000. Although the Afghan government is already putting out that they were involved in these negotiations and it's not going to play out. So, Will, with, kind of that, I guess, brief rundown of the public parts of the peace deal that we know are signed, I'm going to ask you a very general question and take where you want with it. But do you think this is the agreement that will end in the way that me and you mean to end a war, where U.S. troops and contractors withdraw from the country and, maybe there's a contingent, some 100, 200, 300 Marines left at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul or something like that. But as far as actual operations go, they end in 14 months. What do you think the chances are? Do you think that's going to be what happens here?
Well, I think a lot of this depends on just how committed Washington really is to getting out of this thing. Because I think if they wanted to, they could easily take this as an opportunity to really wind this thing down and to pull out our troops and to eventually just to have this be the beginning of the end here in Afghanistan. However, I think there's a big chance that this could fall apart, unfortunately. I think, the Taliban is not the only armed group operating in Afghanistan. And so really, any violence that occurs there, I think if U.S. officials wanted to, they could blame it on the Taliban and easily, revamp our presence there. it does seem like a very good sign that we will see like a very good chunk of our presence there reduced. However, then there are, of course, as you mentioned, the secret annexes in this deal, which we don't have a ton of in-depth detail about. There's a little bit of reporting on it that seems pretty well sourced to, senior administration officials and stuff. But these secret annexes apparently will have, several thousand counterterrorism forces staying in Afghanistan indefinitely. And so, unfortunately, it seems if these reports of the annexes are true, that baked into the Taliban deal is a provision that will allow several thousand forces to stay indefinitely, and that the Taliban apparently had agreed to this. And the idea with keeping these parts of the deal secret was that the Taliban felt like it couldn't really save face and still agree to having these troops stay indefinitely. However, but regardless, it is certainly a good thing. Any drawdown in Afghanistan is a good sign. It's something I would like to see. And as you said, like we are just getting back down to like where we started with the Trump administration. So that's a little unfortunate. He had taken office, with on promises that we would stop with these crazy, costly, endless wars in the Middle East, and now he's just getting back down to where Obama was when he left office. And so that's a little disappointing. I kind of wish it would have gone, a little beyond that. But, I guess any withdrawal is better than nothing. It's sort of how I'm looking at it at this point.
Right. And, I remember there's a libertarian presidential candidate named Jacob Hornberger, and I was listening to one of his speeches, and he had talked about Donald Trump making a trip to Afghanistan, but being appalled that he didn't bring the troops home with him. And that, that's kind of the thing that I would really hope for, is that he would just have Donald Trump be like, all right, we're coming home from Afghanistan. We'll let the Afghan government and the Taliban work it out from there. Maybe the drawdown takes like 3 months to make sure you're not leaving a whole bunch of chemicals everywhere that's going to contaminate and cause birth defects. And you probably don't want to leave too many weapons laying around for people to pick up and use against each other. But other than that, this thing could be, could have been wound down very quickly. And, again, after 135 days, the U.S. has gotten drawn down to 8,600 troops, but those are the Obama troop levels, so it's not like this is a huge drawdown. Another problem with this is that even though the Taliban was finally willing to negotiate with the U.S., they weren't willing to negotiate with the Afghan government through all of this, and so the Afghan government has been left out. As I mentioned, there was a scheduled prisoner swap for March 10th, and maybe it will still happen. Now, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but with the Afghan president saying that his country's not going to participate in it already, it is worrisome then that you have a government with a pretty expensive military bought and paid for by the U.S. If they're carrying out operations against the Taliban respond. I could very much see how people at the New York Times and the John Bolton types, at the war-loving think tanks are gonna say every time there's an attack, where the Taliban kill any Afghan government troops, we can't leave. We have to stay. Look at this chaos that's happening because we're leaving. When in reality, 2019 was one of the most violent years of this war, and so any kind of reduction in violence, and especially by U.S. and Afghan government forces, will be great. Since they were the main killer of civilians last year. But I don't know, Will, to ask you a question after all of that, what kind of role do you think the Afghan government will play? And does this drawdown timetable, is there any indication that the Taliban are going to talk to the Afghan government, or something could be worked out there?
Well, I guess it kind of just depends. Like, we'll have to see going forward whether they'll be willing. As you've sort of suggested, both sides have signaled an unwillingness to talk to each other. Although I think I have seen some chatter that like there are some plans to have them talk, the Taliban and the Afghan government. Of course, Afghanistan just got over this like pretty contentious election where there was like some dispute as to who won. I think there was two guys. There was Abdullah and then Ashraf Ghani. And Ghani apparently has won now. I think the U.S. has not even recognized his presidency quite yet, like his new victory. I don't think they've like confirmed that they accept it as valid. So that could cause some issues too if there's a conflict within the Afghan government of who should be leading. That will not help with the negotiations with the Taliban. But yeah, I would certainly like to see the Taliban and the Afghan government negotiate, because that's like a huge. I think that could really mitigate some of the fallout from us leaving. Because as you said, they're calling this a peace deal. It might not produce peace in Afghanistan. There is some chance that the Taliban could, want to come back and start launching new attacks on Kabul and try to retake the city even. I'm not sure exactly how likely that is. That's, of course, what everyone's saying. That's like the big nightmare scenarios that we leave and the Taliban just marches right back in and tries to take the capital. So, that's certainly a huge risk. And with Trump, I think his I don't like this word, but his calculus here in this situation is, he's looking at 2020. He's looking at his election. And I think that's what he's thinking about is like the risk here is that he could withdraw and he could end this war and wrap it up and run on that and say, hey, like we, declare victory in Afghanistan. But there's also a real big chance that things could go wrong. There could be renewed violence there or something. And then, of course, that would really not look good for him. And so I think that's what Trump, that's why he's not quite ready to just pull out right away. He wants to drag this out and, have the argument that, hey, I'm winding down this war, but at the same time, not have it to where, not risking to where the Taliban might launch a new attack or something. So unfortunately, I think he's not quite, in his position, he's not quite ready to do a rapid drawdown as we would prefer to see.
Right. So I guess the last thing I have, Will, on Afghanistan, that I'll give you a chance to add any last thoughts that you have, is over at the American Conservative, Daniel Larison writes great stuff all the time, but he has a pretty good write-up on the Afghan peace deal and kind of, I think, just shortly goes through and describes how there's an opportunity here to actually end this war through the peace deal, as you've been saying throughout this, and how it gives, us anti-war people kind of something to hold against the Washington and say, oh, no, look, you signed this agreement and, we have to keep up and put that pressure to try to get this war ended. But at the same time, there's just so many complicating things. There's so many hawks. There's so many problems with the peace deal itself, with giving Washington a 14-month timetable. Will, have you ever known the U.S. government to finish a 14-month project anywhere near on time? So I think there's all these problems with it, and so I don't want to just be like, oh, peace deal, because then in a couple months when people check back into Afghanistan, they're gonna be really disappointed, really confused, and think, oh well, look at those lying Taliban. We got to stay there forever. But I don't want to just be pessimistic about it, because there is probably maybe the best time in 18 years now, a chance to actually get U.S. forces out of Afghanistan. Oh, and one thing to mention, our friend Pete Quinones has been pointing this out. And I think it's a really important point that for the U.S., this is just as much of a surrender as it is a draw. I think while it's fine to let Trump pretend like this is a victory or a draw, that way he gets to celebrate coming home, at the end of the day, it's a loss and a surrender.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with that assessment as well, that after 20 years we still have not, how much territory does the Taliban still control? At night I think it's like 60% or something, that they have de facto control over all these districts in Afghanistan. And so I would not call it much of a victory, in any real sense. However, yeah, I'm glad to let, I'm so ready to leave at this point that fine, Donald Trump, go ahead and call it a victory. Take a victory lap. Go ahead and have a big parade about it. I don't care. I just want to see them withdraw. But yeah, as you're saying, a 14-month timetable, that's unfortunately quite enough time, I think, for the Hawks to drive another surge through. It's a big enough window for them to fit that into, if they were really determined to do that. I'm, of course, trying to maintain some kind of optimism and not just poo-poo this. As I think you were saying, we want to see this happen. And so we're trying to cheer this on. And we should keep the pressure on, as you were saying, too, as Larison was talking about, this deal is a good, specific thing to point to and say, hey, you signed this deal, so keep to it. So, yeah, I mean, I guess we'll just have to see how things play out here. A lot of this is going to depend on just how committed the administration is to leaving. Some of this, of course, depends on what actually happens on the ground. But also, the Hawks can always come up with reasons and rationales to renew an offensive or something. And so it's going to depend on them a lot as well.
All right. Well, now I want to go over some stories that you wrote at RT in the past week. This one is China expelling 3 Washington Street Journal reporters. And then the U.S. responded by making a whole bunch of Chinese state media outlets in the United States label themselves as foreign missions, which really changes the way they're treated and what kind of filing they do and how much of their business they have to report to the U.S. government. So tell us a little bit more about this.
Yeah, sure. So the Wall Street Journal had put out this op-ed. I forget exactly what the headline was, but in the headline it said something about China is the sick man of Asia, which is like a term that's used often to describe like a country that's just, having tons of problems, like a regional power that's having all kinds of issues and problems, and they're kind of stagnating. And so the idea this op-ed had called China the sick man of Asia, and it had suggested that the Chinese government, and we'll talk about this a little later, that the Chinese government, though, is covering up the number of coronavirus cases. Like, it had accused Chinese officials of downplaying that. And so the Chinese government took great offense to this, and they decided to expel the 3 reporters that were behind that Wall Street Journal piece. And so, yeah, they gave them 5 days to leave the country, and they just forced them to leave. And so the U.S., though, responded to this by, as you said, labeling, I think it was like 5 or 6 Chinese state media outlets. It was Xinhua. I forget the whole list of them, but Xinhua was like the biggest one. But they designated them as foreign missions, which kind of like they're still allowed to operate in the United States. The U.S. didn't quite respond in kind by kicking them out, but by making them foreign missions, that means now that these news outlets will have to report a lot more about their whereabouts and like how they're spending money, and like there'll just be greater restrictions and like a magnifying glass basically put over what they're doing. And so, of course, the Chinese took great offense to this as well. They were not happy to have that retaliation. Now, I should say that I'm not really in favor of what China did here. I don't think the article that they were so offended about, it was just an opinion piece. It wasn't really I guess they did make some factual claims about the Chinese government, but still, nonetheless, that's pretty common in you should expect that in media, in a free media landscape. Some outlets will be criticizing you. And so I'm not cool with them doing that. Of course, I'm also not okay with what the U.S. has done here, too. And since the U.S. designated these media outlets as foreign missions, which I should note is separate from the RT, for example, was hit with they were forced to register as a foreign agent. And that under the FARA Act or something. And that's a different thing. The foreign missions designation is separate, I think, from the foreign agent thing. It's not quite as strict. But nonetheless, the State Department has since threatened that they could expel, hundreds of Chinese journalists operating in the U.S. because of all this, because of this controversy over the Wall Street Journal report. And so, I certainly hope that doesn't happen. I don't want to see Chinese journalists expelled from the U.S., just as I don't want to see Wall Street Journal reporters expelled from China. But that's sort of the situation right now.
Yeah, my concern, especially looking at this as an American will, is that the U.S. is taking another step against media organizations that's going to make them it more difficult for them to do journalism. And, as much as RT or these Chinese state-funded media organizations may have some bias or angle towards Russia or China, at the end of the day, they do good journalism at times and important writing like you do over at RT. And so, there's really no reason that you would want to censor this media. And as the U.S. government expands power, as it always does, it might start applying it to American citizens. And, I have to imagine that, if you were doing freelance work or something, Will, as an American, you could be one of those people potentially targeted with something like this. So, it is that in that sense, it's concerning to me.
Yeah, definitely. It sets up the U.S. government, as we know, as we've seen with so many different stories, with the Assange story, with so many different things. The U.S. government is not a real fan of real investigative journalism and stuff. So certainly this sets some kind of bad precedent.
All right. Well, so the next one of your stories that I want to cover is something that I have covered in minimal detail on the show. And that is the increasing tensions between the Hindu nationalist government in India led by Modi and then the 180 million Muslims that live in India or in the occupied Kashmir region. There's, as far as I could tell, 2 major things that have happened. One is kind of the restructuring or reorganizing how India occupies Kashmir. And it's a situation now that people are kind of warning it in a very general sense could turn Kashmir into something of a West Bank. And then you also had this new citizenship law that Muslims felt like they were kind of the target of. And it was a part of Modi's general restructuring of Indian society against Muslims. And so there actually hadn't been as much violence around this as I was afraid of, although there is a very large blackout in Kashmir, so there may be, more people there kind of being taken out quietly, and it's just not reported on the international media at all. But we now have riots breaking out, I believe, in actually the capital, at least at times there, and has resulted in several dozen deaths. So, Will, tell us what you can about the citizenship law and the now riots that have come in response.
Sure. So, yeah, as you said, there's a lot of big stuff happening in India in the last few months, and a lot of it has to do with this citizenship law that was passed in December, or it's called the Citizenship Amendment Act, or the CAA. And when if you're reading the Indian press, for example, they mostly will just say the CAA. So if you see that, that's what they're referring to is this bill. So on the face of it, this law is supposed to create a fast track to Indian citizenship for religious minorities that are facing persecution in 3 neighboring countries to India. And that would be Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. But because it's specifically about minorities in each of these 3 countries, and because each of those 3 countries are Muslim majority, the law exempts Muslims for this sped up citizenship process. And so the defenders of the law, and this kind of breaks down into left and right to, just to generalize and oversimplify a little bit. But, you have the conservatives supporting this bill and the liberals and the sort of left leaning folks opposing it. And so the supporters put a lot of focus on this point about minorities. And they're saying that simply by definition, the bill does not apply to Muslims, given their majority status in those 3 countries. And they say that, Muslims are still perfectly free to apply for Indian citizenship by the normal process. And so that's the argument in favor of it. That's what you're often going to hear, the government itself saying, and as well as supporters of Modi's government saying this. And technically, I think that stuff is true, that it doesn't preclude Muslims from getting citizenship. Though I should point out that, of course, it is possible for a minority faction or sect to be oppressed by the majority, even if they were all Muslims. So their argument, I don't think, totally applies, doesn't totally fly. But nonetheless, the critics are saying that this law is extremely discriminatory toward Muslims. And they're saying, as you were sort of referring to, it's part of this agenda of the ruling party, of the BJP, to act out against Muslims and to sort of oppress them and to make them second-class citizens. And the BJP does certainly have some hardline Hindu nationalist elements, or what they call Hindutva. And Hindutva is kind of if you're not familiar with it, the best way to compare it would be to say it's like an Indian version of Zionism, which sort of says that India is for the Hindus, just like Zionism kind of says Israel's for the Jews. And so, I think there is some truth to what the critics are saying about this is just part of an ongoing agenda. And the people who oppose the bill don't only look at the citizenship law. They're seeing this in conjunction with other things. As you mentioned, you have India's move last summer to revoke Kashmir's special autonomy status. And there's been, an internet blackout, and they've sent a bunch of thousands of troops to occupy the state of Kashmir. And Kashmir is India's only Muslim majority state. And so the critics are seeing a connection between this. And then you've also got this proposed National Register of Citizens, which is also called the NRC. And this law, they haven't quite imposed it yet on a nationwide basis, but the law threatens to strip a lot of people of citizenship if they're unable to produce certain documents. And the critics of this bill are saying they're expecting it to have some disproportionate impact on Muslims. And they've actually already rolled out a citizenship register in the state of Assam, where there's a pretty big Muslim plurality. And it seems to have had some of the negative effects that people are predicting if it's imposed nationwide. And so with all this stuff in mind, all these things happening, the citizenship bill, the Kashmir stuff, the National Register of Citizens, about a week ago, while Trump was actually in India for his first state visit there, things got way out of hand. There have been a lot of ongoing protests over the citizenship law in Kashmir and the rest of it. But last week, there was one particular protest in the capital city of New Delhi, and a local BJP politician had demanded that the police go and break it up. And he's saying if the cops don't go do it, he's going to organize a group of people and do it himself. And so the cops, of course, didn't do anything. I'm pretty sure the protest that in question was legal. They had the right to be there. And so this politician, the guy named Mishra, followed through with his threat. He gathered up a mob of people and tried to clear away these protesters. And from there, things just drastically escalated. You ended up with these roving mobs, sort of along religious lines or political lines, people in favor and against the citizenship law. And a lot of the time it was Hindu mobs and Muslim mobs. But you had these gangs of people going around attacking each other, burning down buildings, and generally rampaging through New Delhi, northeast New Delhi. A lot of districts were paralyzed by this. And this rioting lasted for 3 whole days. And by the time it was all said and done, 42 people had been killed at least. There might be more now. Like, I know people were succumbing to injuries over the last few days. And you had 200 people with serious injuries. A lot of people were shot. A lot of people were beaten and stabbed, or they were killed with stones. There was all kinds of like these mobs were hurling stones at each other. It was a very common thing. But then, of course, you also had, and you can see this in some of the imagery, like Reuters has some crazy photos of these riots, but people throwing Molotov cocktails and drawing guns on each other and pulling out knives and swords. It was an extremely intense 3 days of clashes. But after it died down, after a few days, after the police like finally intervened and started, doing these heavy armed patrols in the city, and they at one point imposed a curfew, it finally died down after like 3 days. And so now there's all kinds of blame going around, of course, which is also sort of along religious and political lines. There's one side saying this was all planned by the BJP and by Modi's government to, it's just another step in their, attack on Muslims. And then, of course, the other side saying that it's all the Muslims' fault and that they had started this somehow, that it's their fault for protesting. From what I've read and what I've seen, though, it does seem like there's a lot of responsibility to go around here in this whole situation. The cops, right in the early stages of this thing, kind of let this happen. Like, they didn't intervene to stop when there were, those mobs were roving around attacking each other. And then it seems the mobs on both sides did help to escalate this thing into what it became. Like, one group of guys would catch wind of something that happened elsewhere in New Delhi, and then they would gather a mob and go and start, basically repeat what they had just heard. So there's a lot of like tit for tat escalation, that there's a lot of opportunity for this thing to wind down, and it just didn't, unfortunately. And you ended up with these 3 days of clashes. And unfortunately, India is not really a stranger to this kind of like communal violence. In one high profile case in 1984, there was like a massive pogrom of Sikhs after India's prime minister at the time, Indira Gandhi, was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards. And the rioting in 1984 ended up killing 3,000 Sikhs. And so like it looks similar to this unrest that we've seen recently in New Delhi. But fortunately, that was not quite as bad as things that we have seen in India in the past, with this kind of communal violence and pogroms and stuff. It's unfortunate. A lot of people were hurt and killed in these recent riots. A lot of property was damaged and destroyed. For those few days, people were like afraid to leave their homes. They were in fear of getting caught up in this violence. Journalists were being targeted, so reporters were afraid to even go and cover this. So generally, it's not a very happy story. And I think I certainly hope we won't see any more violence like this, but I think we'll definitely see more contention over the citizenship law in Kashmir and all the stuff that I had referred to.
I just have one last question on this, Will. And I saw just a couple headlines that, especially in the mainstream media, I really haven't seen any coverage of what's been going on in India, since all this really started to unfold with the Kashmir situation, but then linking it along with Donald Trump's visit. So as far as you could tell, did that visit have anything to do with what set off the riots? Was it just a matter of timing, or I don't know. I was just curious if you saw any links there.
I do actually think there was some connection. And so that local BJP politician, Mishra, I forget his first name, his last name's Mishra, the guy who initially demanded that protest in New Delhi break up, I think he was partially motivated. He was like, part of his argument there was like, the U.S. president is here, like, don't embarrass us with your protests. Like, come on, like, at least for this week or this couple days, like, don't make a scene or something. And so I think that was sort of where he was coming from. And I think maybe the protesters might have had some of that in mind, too, that, hey, we're going to make a show of this while the U.S. president's here so that maybe he takes our side or something. And so I don't think it was, 100% to blame or anything, but I do think it played into like the timing of this, of when these people decided to protest and why the BJP politician had like responded to it so harshly. It's because Donald Trump was in the country at the time.
All right. And, I guess a whole lot of media, too, that usually isn't paying a whole lot of attention to that situation. But we should move on to Syria, where we have a very delicate and dangerous situation unfolding in the Idlib province, Will. And so I'm just going to go ahead. I know you've covered this in a couple articles over at RT, but there's probably a lot more gaps to fill in. So go ahead and kind of give us an update on what's going on there.
Sure. So yeah, as you said, this is the situation in Idlib has like really started to blow up again. And right now you have what seems to be Turkey and Syria backed by Russia, of course, seems they are heading toward what could be a serious confrontation. So as your audience, I think, is aware, for years now, the Syrian government's been fighting to retake the Idlib province piece by piece. It's like the last remaining holdout for the rebel opposition, which for years was backed by the U.S. under the Obama administration. And now many of the same rebel groups are supported by Turkey. And so just by way of context, though, back in 2018, Syria and Russia and Turkey had struck this deal to hold off a new offensive in Idlib, to hold off Assad from trying to retake the province. And the Turks were saying at the time that they were worried this was going to drive more refugees into Turkey. So they were, they were against any new effort to retake the province. And Turkey's already taken in, it depends on who you ask and whose numbers you're looking at, but hundreds of thousands or millions of Syrian refugees that are fleeing the fighting. And the Turks are saying they can't take in any more. They were at the time, and they still are saying that. But this 2018 deal, though, tried to de-escalate the conflict by creating these ceasefire zones where the rebels were supposed to, either vacate certain areas or stay there and put down their heavy weapons. And then the Turks were supposed to help to oversee this by setting up observation posts and to help to separate the radical jihadist groups from the supposedly moderate ones that are still left in Idlib there. But however, last April, though, Assad decided that the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, decided that the rebels were not abiding by this deal. And a bunch of rebel groups had been refusing to leave the buffer zone and continuing to fight and launch attacks. And so the Syrians ended up starting up this new offensive anyway. And that was like the middle of last year. But that's kind of gone in fits and starts since then. Like the offensive is kind of like flared up every once in a while. But just this month, though, or I guess it's March now, but in February, Assad renewed the push to retake Idlib. And over this last week or so, in that renewed push to retake Idlib, a few dozen Turkish soldiers ended up getting killed in Syrian strikes. And it might be higher by now, but the death toll that I last saw in Reuters was 55 Turkish soldiers had been killed in these strikes. And the Russians are saying that Assad, when they killed these these Turkish troops, that Assad was actually attacking an area controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, the umbrella group that contains Al-Qaeda, the main Al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria, and it's along with a bunch of other hardline Islamist militias. And so the Russians are saying that Turkey was commingling its guys with these jihadists and, not telling Damascus about the whereabouts of its soldiers. And so that's Russia's argument here, is that that's how these Turkish soldiers ended up getting killed, is that they were not, their location and whereabouts were not made known to the Syrian government. But either way, because of these Turkish casualties, we've seen rapid escalation now between the Turks on the one side and then Syria and Russia on the other side. And that kind of brings us to where we are today. We've been seeing over the last week or so, we've been seeing all kinds of threats and hostile rhetoric, especially from Turkey. And all of that was sort of triggered by the death of these Turkish troops. And now I think Turkish soldiers have been caught up before in Syrian strikes, but they were just like one or two previously. And now it's like several dozen. And so Turkey is now saying that if Assad doesn't halt his operation to retake Idlib, they're going to start treating Syrian forces as legitimate targets. And in fact, I think already have started doing that. And they've already now deployed like 7,500 soldiers at least and 2,700 vehicles to Idlib and carried out a lot of air and artillery strikes on Syrian army positions already. And the last I had seen, I think you might have more recent figures, but they were saying they had attacked 200 targets and killed several hundred Syrian troops. I think now they've raised that to over 1,000. It's not totally clear to me if these numbers are accurate, if they're exaggerated. But nonetheless, Turkey is certainly launching attacks on Syrian positions. And Assad, of course, is not backing down. He's not going to, give in to the Turkish demand to stop the offensive. And so now this has really put the two sides, Syria and Turkey, on a collision course here. And to me, what's particularly worrying is that Turkey now is trying to drag NATO into this whole thing, into this conflict. They've even suggested that the Article 5 of the NATO agreement should be triggered, which would mean that every NATO state would have to come to Turkey's defense against Syria and Russia. And Erdogan's also been threatening again, and I wrote an article about this specifically, but threatening, as he has many times before, to unleash hundreds of thousands of refugees into Europe. And I think that's part of how he's trying to pressure some of the European NATO states to sort of come to his side. Fortunately, I don't think NATO is going to trigger Article 5 here. But certainly this is one way we could end up with a world war. If it were to happen, this is sort of how it would happen, is like by a mutual defense pact like this activating. And that's exactly the problem, I think, with something like NATO, is it sets up these giant tripwires that could, massively escalate what is kind of a small conflict into like a regional conflict or to a global conflict. So that's kind of worrying, even though I'm pretty sure that NATO is not going to activate Article 5. Still, it's just like, even flirting with that is pretty worrying. And now,
right. Well, maybe to talk a little bit more about the refugee thing here real quick, because it is, I think that's like the specific thing that Erdogan is trying to level against Europe, to invoke Article 4 or 5 or I think what he's looking for is a no-fly zone over Syria. And I'm not sure if he is going to include Turkey in that, or he wants to be allowed to bomb Syrian forces in defense of the terrorists. But either way, I guess he started to at least allow a few thousand refugees to flow, it seems, specifically into Greece. And this has now caused some clashes between police and refugees, where they're using tear gas against the refugees, and the people are throwing stones. And it seems so far like nearly 1,000 have made it into Greece. But, we are talking about, they say 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. My guess is that number's a little bit lower now because they have resettled some in Afrin and other areas in northeast Syria. I know other people are now being pushed across the border from Idlib. My guess is that number was probably a little bit inflated by Erdogan, just looking to get more funding to make it look like he's solving a bigger problem for the Europeans. But, we're talking about a few thousand now, but if 1 million people, 500,000 people, try to cross into Europe from Turkey, that is going to be a real nightmare for the Europeans to try to deal with. And so, even if, they decide to just try to close the borders or something like that, I think you're talking about a pretty nasty situation coming across. So, that's just a problem I'm seeing coming here. And then, we're talking about Turkey launching their new operation. I think officially either the last day of February or the first day of March. They're calling it Spring Shield. I don't know. They seem to have a shield thing because the first operation they launched into Syria a few years ago was Euphrates Shield. But this one is apparently to defend the Al-Qaeda HTS forces there. And they say they've shot down 2 Syrian planes, that they have killed or wounded or captured 2,200 Syrian soldiers, destroyed 100 Syrian tased scores of Syrian artillery positions, and also killed 9 Hezbollah fighters in a drone strike. So it seems like there are a lot of operations going on right now in Syria. And the disturbing thing is that this is a NATO country. And as you point out, now fighting against a very close ally of Russia.
Yeah, and also worrying too is that, the U.S. Being the main country in NATO has already signaled that they're going to take Turkey's side in this, particularly the State Department, which has had several recent statements, coming out in support of Turkey. And I think some U.S. officials have even said that we're going to start providing them intelligence support and maybe some military equipment here. And Turkey's actually already asked, this is kind of ironic, Turkey's asked the U.S. to send over some Patriot batteries, which is ironic considering the whole drama over Turkey buying Russia's S-400 missile defense system. There's been all this bickering over that with Turkey and the U.S. officials. So it's funny they're asking for Patriot batteries. But at this point, fortunately, nobody's talking quite about yet, at least nobody's talking about sending U.S. troops to go back them up or anything like that. So that hopefully, we can avoid that. And as well as, the NATO invoking Article 5. Now, as you said about the refugees, Erdogan's threatened to do this many times in the past, but now it seems he really means business. You had some officials going out and telling Reuters that we're no longer going to stop refugees from crossing borders from on the land or by sea. So the Coast Guard and all these people are standing down in Turkey apparently to allow these refugees to go into, as you said, Greece, which is sort of one of the first waypoints after Turkey on their way into Europe. And so that could cause some massive problems for the Europeans. But I don't believe that it will, I don't think Erdogan's quite going to be able to get all he wants from the Europeans. They're, I think, reluctant to get highly involved in this whole Syrian thing, in this whole Idlib situation. Now, fortunately, there have been some recent meetings between Russian and Turkish officials. And just recently, they actually signaled that they want to de-escalate tensions over Idlib. And so I think that's a good sign that there are meetings over this. And the Russians even came out and said, the Russian Defense Ministry came out and said that Turkey had agreed that operations against jihadists should continue in Idlib. And so that might suggest that they're figuring out some way to work this out. Now, I don't know, the Russians might have been overstating what the Turks actually agreed to, because you'd think that they would not be okay with a continued offensive against even, jihadist groups, because some of those that, Turkey backs itself. Turkey's main rebel faction in Syria is the Syrian National Army, which is the rebranded Free Syrian Army. But I think it's pretty there's pretty widespread suspicions that Turkey backs a lot of these groups, like even the more radical jihadist ones. And so if Turkey did agree that Syria should continue its offensive against these jihadist groups in Idlib, then that might suggest that they're figuring out some way to de-escalate this.
And I should add, apparently, at least the staffs of top Russian and American generals spoke over the phone about the situation here. And so, hopefully that means that, we're not going to have an accident where Turkey kills Russian soldiers. And then, we are looking at a much bigger problem. Of course, even then, it is important to remember this, I believe, is pretty close to the area of Syria where a Russian jet was flying when it was shot down by the Turkish military a couple years ago. And Putin and Erdogan were able to walk bad tensions from that. And, even as you mentioned, ironically, end up with Erdogan buying the Russian S-400 missile defense system. So there's a lot going on here, and a very dangerous situation. But at the same time, this can be resolved, and there I guess is enough diplomacy possible. Is there anything else about Syria that we should add, or you want to talk about here?
I think we covered all the main bits. Certainly it is, this has a great potential to escalate into something far larger than what it currently is. But as we sort of mentioned, I think there's some chance that's not going to happen. That we've seen some, overtures to diplomacy here, and the Turks and the Russians are meeting and talking about this. But I would just urge your audience to keep an eye on this stuff and, follow the situation in Idlib.
All right. Well, the last thing I have for you on today's show is to ask you about the coronavirus. I'm kind of nervous about going to the liquor store and picking up a 6-pack of my favorite beer. So dispel any hysteria that might be going on, and just how serious is this, and specifically what's going on in Iran.
Sure. So this new virus going around, the coronavirus, or COVID-19, as the World Health Organization has now named it, it's become a pretty big deal in some countries. So I won't totally downplay the severity of this. Even though it hasn't yet been officially classified as a pandemic, I think it technically is, depending on what definition you go by. There are outbreaks on multiple continents now, and there's a lot of transmission across international borders. So technically, I think it does fit the definition of a pandemic. So far, this thing has killed 3,000 people worldwide, including a couple American citizens so far. There were 1 or 2 overseas that died, and there was one just recently here in the United States, in Washington State, who passed away from this. And so far, this thing has spread to about 87,000 people all around the world. Now, the vast majority of infections are in China, in mainland China, but there have also been some pretty big outbreaks now in South Korea, in Italy, in Japan, and as well as Iran. There's also a cruise ship that was parked off the coast of Japan that had 700 cases, which is one of the biggest hotspots for this illness so far. And the U.S. so far has confirmed 70 cases in the country. However, only a few hundred people have even been tested at this point in the U.S., so there could well be more than the 70. But it doesn't seem there's any kind of widespread transmission yet in the United States. And in total, this thing has spread to something like 30 countries now. So while this is all pretty worrying, all these figures, seeing the 87,000 figure is pretty alarming. We should note that 42,000 people have already recovered from this illness, which is nearly half of the confirmed cases. And the mortality rate, if we look at these figures, it's only about 2 or 3%, which, compared to something like Ebola is nothing. Ebola has a far, far higher mortality rate. So we're not looking at something that's severely fatal. And as far as I understand with the coronavirus, most cases are pretty mild. It's pretty common, cold symptoms, a sore throat and a cough. And generally, if the numbers that we're given are somewhat accurate, and I'll get into more of this in a second, then I think it's way too early to be panicking. So just to put this into context, in 2009 and 2010, the swine flu, or H1N1, ended up infecting a shocking number of people. I don't think people realize how bad the H1N1 got. It infected 760 million people, or at least suspected cases. Some people say 1 billion. And so, and this thing ended up killing a couple 100,000, the swine flu. And we're still all here after that happened, and it seems if you're not paying attention to this, if you're not following things like this, it sort of just blows over without incident, it seems like. But when you're really paying attention, it seems a lot scarier when you see the disease toll climb, steadily. And so, I think a lot of people probably remember the swine flu outbreak, the whole H1N1 thing, hearing about it in the news. But I don't think many people realize just how severe that got. And so right now, we're not looking at anything close to the swine flu in terms of the coronavirus. Now, of course, on the other side of things, there have been a lot of like extreme claims made about this coronavirus and like conspiracy theories even. And even though I think a lot of these are wrong or totally baseless, like I think it's still worth considering what these people are saying. And so one of the most common claims here is that the Chinese government is like vastly underreporting its cases, as they were also accused of doing during the SARS outbreak in the early 2000s. And I'm not sure what the truth is exactly to that. I know there's a lot of claims in the mainstream press that China covered up the numbers of the SARS outbreak. And so people are saying they're doing that now with the coronavirus. And there's some people saying that there's up to 1.5 million people who've been infected with this, and that way more than the 3,000 have been killed. And way more than the 3,000 in the official tally have been killed. And there's really no way for us to know what the real total number of this disease is. But I think that same thing applies to the people who are giving us these crazy, huge numbers. Like they don't actually know this either, and they're just being alarmist. Now, I certainly don't put it past the Chinese government to downplay the severity of the illness. Like, I think that's a perfectly valid concern that they're doing that. But I just would like to see some evidence for like, these huge claims that there are 1 million people infected, or things like, there have been people saying that it's a bioweapon and stuff like that. Like I've seen no good evidence to support that. Before I get to Iran, though, I will point out there's one other thing that people have noted. And I have to admit, this is kind of odd, is that China's only biosafety level 4 lab, which is like the highest level lab where they research the most dangerous and contagious viruses. That lab is in the city of Wuhan, which is like the exact epicenter where the virus broke out. So that's kind of a weird coincidence that their highest level virology lab is right there in the city where the virus broke out. But I don't know. It does make sense to me, though, that they would be studying because they are studying coronaviruses here at this virology lab in Wuhan. Like there's solid proof of that. But to me, it makes sense that they'd be studying a disease like the coronavirus because SARS is also a coronavirus. So I don't know. Like I think a lot of these things could just be coincidental. So I wouldn't take too much from that, the location of this virus lab. However, in Iran right now, that's where one of the largest outbreaks is at. And there've been like I forget the exact number now. I haven't checked the figures today. I think it's like under 1,000 still, but several hundred people have been infected in Iran. And quite a few people have died. Like Iran has one of the higher mortality rates out of anywhere with the coronavirus, which might suggest just that like they're not capturing the total number of confirmed cases. Because usually if they've confirmed X amount of deaths, that would suggest like with the 2% mortality rate that there'd be X amount of cases. So it might just be that Iran has missed some of the cases so far. But in recent news, the U.S. actually had just offered to give assistance to Iran with its coronavirus outbreak, and the Iranians were not really happy about this. Like, you'd think, hey, they're being offered help, but you have to consider at the same time that Washington is maintaining these crippling sanctions on the Iranian economy, and some of these sanctions do affect their healthcare sector. And so, the spokesman for the Iranian Foreign Ministry, Mousavi, came out and was just like, completely indignant about this offer for help. He totally was like, maybe you could help us by, stopping the sanctions that are crippling our economy right now and making it hard to treat these cases and making it hard to just, making a lot of things hard in Iran. And so that's, I don't know, kind of ironic the U.S. is offering this help when like there's a pretty clear way they could help by, scaling back some of the sanctions. But I think they're kind of just trying to like score some points politically here, that the U.S. is just trying to, look good in terms of offering help while also maintaining these crippling sanctions. So, that was sort of an interesting recent story related to this thing in Iran.
Yeah, Matthew Pate actually has a good one out today at the National Interest on this, explaining that especially like some things like insulin is clearly medical, but then things to prevent the flu maybe, or things that you need in hospitals aren't as clearly medical equipment like face masks and hazmat suits. And so those have actually been hit by sanctions. And, that is a problem that Iran's had. And, check out his article over at the National Interest. But it's pretty clear that the U.S. sanctions definitely harmed Iran's economy in a way that is going to make this outbreak worse in that country.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So like you do have these sanctions affecting their medical sector. And just real quick, I just wanted to grab the latest figure for Iran. Now it's up to 978 people who are confirmed to have this illness in Iran. And they say 54 have died. But as I said, like I think that the death toll that they've already confirmed, which actually I think like a high-ranking cleric has already died, and 7 other high-ranking officials have been confirmed to have this virus. So it's affecting more than just the broader Iranian population. It's also officials getting this thing too. And so, yeah, they have 978 confirmed cases and 54 deaths. And those deaths might, suggest that there's a greater number of cases, just like if we just go by the mortality rate we've seen elsewhere.
All right. Well, do you have anything else to add on the coronavirus?
No, don't think so. I certainly would urge people to, not panic about this, but certainly, wash your hands, stuff like that. Maybe pay attention to the news to see if there are outbreaks in your area or something, because there have been some in the United States on the East and West Coast. But particularly, I think the West Coast has had more cases. And so, yeah, this is not something like you probably have more to worry about from the common cold at this point in terms of how many people are killed each year by that and how many people are infected. But it is still something you shouldn't necessarily ignore it. There is some danger with this. It's obviously this coronavirus has killed a lot of people in China. And so, don't panic, but, pay attention, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Be smart about it and reasonable, rational, somewhere in the middle. I'm sure the general public is great at that. So we'll tell people where to find your work and where to keep up with you to get everything that you're writing over at RT.
Sure. So, as you said at the beginning of the show, you can find everything I write at RT shared in my Twitter handle, which is at WKPANCAP, ANCAP. And you can find it on my Facebook as well. I'm just Will Porter on there. And if you want to, I don't get bylines at RT. I'm just a staff writer there. I cover the news. But yeah, you can find my stuff at RT.com. And other bylines at antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, Consortium News, a place called the Daily Sheeple. I got 100 or so articles there. And yeah, that's where you can find me.
All right. Thanks, Will.
All right. Thanks, Cal.